Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance. Calling it Bidenomics, the Biden administration promoting President Biden's economic agenda as one that's focused on the middle class. But some Republicans say not so fast. NTD's Iris Tao has more.
In a speech in Chicago today, President Biden condemned what he called trickle-down economics while selling his own economic platform, now dubbed as Bidenomics.
Bidenomics is working. The economy that grows the economy from the middle out, the bottom up, instead of just the top down. When that happens, everybody does well.
And President Biden says that under Bidenomics, the rich will have to pay their fair share in taxes, while the middle class will prosper with new opportunities and new investments.
We're doing all this, reducing the deficit at the same time.
The history is very clear on this.
But an economist told me,
when we increased the regulatory budget and when we increased taxes, when we adopted policies that are very similar to Bidenomics. And in those 52 years, we had zero increase in our living standards.
The Congressional Budget Office projected today that a U.S. deficit will soar in the coming years with a rise in government spending. But while President Biden says
it takes time to get it out in the field, it takes time for them to see it.
Maybe this is the one time that things will work. That's what they say about socialism.
Meanwhile, congressional Republicans are also reacting to the new branding by the White House. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy today called Bidenomics an economic disaster with decades-high inflation. But despite a low approval rating of his handling of the economy, President Biden insisted today that he has a plan that's turning things around quickly. Reporting from the White House, Iris Tao, NTD News.
And getting creative, imagine that the federal income tax is completely wiped out and replaced by a sales tax on everything else that you buy. That idea and presidential candidate Ron DeSantis's support for it has attracted negative ads from the Trump campaign. NTD's Melina Wisecup brings us that story.
Former President Trump is pulling back support on a tax idea that he once expressed openness to. That is the national sales tax, also known as the fair tax. It would impose a 23% sales tax on every item and service that we buy.
What kind of impacts will this have on Americans overall?
Having a national sales tax will mean that every good and every service will be more expensive. And the problem is that the IRS does need reforming, but this is not how you reform the tax code. Companies won't have to pay taxes anymore, so corporations will be exempt from taxes, and the full tax burden will be on consumers.
The national sales tax is an idea that Governor Ron DeSantis has long supported, Trump now making it a target in his primary campaign ads, like this one.
Huge tax cuts for nearly everyone. And Ron DeSantis, he's pushing a bill that would swap those tax cuts for a new 23% national sales tax, making families pay more.
Now, DeSantis's campaign team has criticized the ads, saying that they lack context because the idea, as Governor Ron DeSantis supported it when he served in Congress, also replaces the federal income tax and it eliminates the IRS. DeSantis also points to Trump's previous openness to the idea as expressed here.
What your tax plan would look like.
So you can have fair tax, you can have flat tax, and you can take the existing plans that we have and simplify.
That second idea mentioned by Trump, the flat tax, is not based on consumption. Instead, it would simplify the tax code and require every taxpayer to pay the same percentage on income tax. But despite Trump's criticism of the fair tax, some in Congress who are strong conservatives are still supporting it. Lawmakers such as Kat Cammack, Ralph Norman, Buddy Carter, and others have endorsed the bill.
I think that they look at this as tax reform. The good intentions are there, but they haven't thought this through and what this is going to mean for the economy.
The question now is, will these conservatives make it a priority to try to force a vote on this fair tax bill? If just a small portion of the conservatives in the House are strongly pushing for this, it is something that we could see them force Speaker McCarthy's hand on, just based on what we've seen happen in Congress over the past few months. Reporting from Capitol Hill, Melina Wisecup, NTD News.
Republican presidential candidate and Miami Mayor Francis Suarez caught off guard by a question over China's human rights violations. This in an interview with radio show host Hugh Hewitt. Suarez appeared unaware of who the Uyghurs were.
Will you be talking about the Uyghurs in your campaign? What, the what?
The Uyghurs.
What's a Uyghur?
Okay, we'll come back to that.
The Uyghurs are a Muslim ethnic minority in the Xinjiang region of western China. In recent years, reports have exposed the Chinese regime's persecution of the group. Over 1 million Uyghurs have been subjected to forcible mass detention, forced labor, forced sterilization, and political indoctrination sessions. The U.S. has declared the persecution a genocide and banned imports from Xinjiang over concerns of forced labor. Suarez announced his bid for president earlier this month. He's considered a long-shot candidate in the crowded Republican primary. With regard to the Uyghurs, the Miami mayor assured Hewitt he would study up on them. The news about the Chinese Communist regime's spy base in Cuba troubling to both lawmakers and everyday Americans. What will that spy base actually be doing, and how much of a threat might it be to the United States? Joining us now to discuss, we have Steve Yates, Senior Fellow and China Policy Initiative Chair at America First Policy Institute. Steve Yates, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course, Steve, with regard to China or the CCP building military facilities in Cuba, just how big of a threat is this to the United States?
Well, I think it's shocking news to a lot of casual observers across the United States, but it's also a shock to the system in Washington that has for decades talked about China as a potential partner and that we are going to have this engagement that would narrow differences and solve problems. And I think Xi Jinping has turned that paradigm on its head. This is, I think, very provocative news in the sense that it's a pretty bold national security challenge right on our shores in a theater that people don't think of with regard to the Pacific, because it's not in the Pacific. But I think it's one of those things where it really does plant a provocative flag for distraction, or worse, should Beijing choose to move against Taiwan, Japan, or other assets in East Asia. It would be something that's troubling for the United States to have kind of two-front action going on.
Steve, should there be some type of red line here? I know I've asked you this before when it comes to these types of moves, or has the CCP just mastered the art of blurring that so-called line?
Well, they're very, very good at crossing and blurring lines. And in the West, we tend to be kind people who want to let bygones be bygones and solve problems and move forward because we don't have malign intent. But the same can't be said for Beijing under the Communist Party. I am very much opposed to drawing red lines that you don't take seriously and are not prepared to back up. And so that's the difference between, say, President Obama trying to draw a red line in Syria that just gets blurred and overrun for very, very many years, and say Donald Trump saying you're going to have to move some of these assets out or they'll be hit, and then he delivers a tactical strike that gives the demonstration effect. So if we are going to draw a red line, we have to be serious about it. I do think that this is a significant change. Really what the red line should be is for policymakers in Washington to change the assumptions of our approach about the CCP. This is a hostile Cold War-like development, and that needs to broaden the frame that our officials take China, somewhat akin to what the House is doing on its select committee on strategic competition with the Chinese Communist Party.
So, Steve, what sorts of activity or operations will be carried out in this facility, do you think? And is there a concern that it doesn't stop at just whatever that might be? And what else can be should we be concerned about?
Well, there's a political warfare component that's very significant in some ways, that even if there is a light footprint by the People's Liberation Army or related organs in the territory of Cuba, that has kind of a provocative political strategic signal. There's the surveillance capabilities, given that we have Special Operations Command and the Central Command based not very far from where this facility might be. And then there's, of course, the material concerns. I mean, back in the Kennedy administration, there was concern about Soviet strategic missiles being moved to that geography. There are a whole host of material components that, should they show up there and tied to the People's Liberation Army, that would be a very provocative strategic challenge to the United States.
Steve, do you think this could have, I mean, I know hindsight's 20/20, but could this have been prevented?
Well, the only way it really could be prevented is if we had some strong sense of deterrence in the world. And sadly, I think since the withdrawal from Afghanistan and the failure to deter Russia in Europe, there's a long string of examples where deterrence has fallen. So there's that component that there's really no substitute for if the United States and its allies are seen as strong, unified on the ascent, and with real tools to impose deterrence, then adversaries bide their time or find other ways. And then there's the question of if we could take a different approach to this hemisphere. I think that multiple administrations have fallen short of what a positive American engagement should be with this hemisphere, for everything from manufacturing to strategic connections that would address our immigration and security challenges, but also make it so that China doesn't really have an avenue. They're not a market for this kind of thing in this hemisphere, and we've just fallen short in that area.
Steve Yates, really appreciate your perspective. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.